incredibly successful at bringing global attention to the apartheid regime in Africa. Were you aware of the efforts being made here in Ireland? And I'm particularly cognizant of Dunnes Stores, one of the grocery stores here in Ireland. The workers there refused to handle South African goods during the 1980s. It ended up being one of the longest industrial disputes in Irish history. Were you aware of those actions that were being carried out at a local level, and how much did they mean to you?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I remember the Dunnes strikes.
Dunnes Stores, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure. No, but you had here in Ireland one of our leading people, Professor Kadasmal, an ANC member, was at Trinity. I mean, I came here, I did an anti-apartheid meeting at the University of Cork.
Tell us more about that.
No, it was.
What was that like?
It was very good. The Irish anti-apartheid, they arranged these meetings, and they said to me, "Come, there's a meeting must address in Cork." Fine, came, and it was at the university. It was very good. The hall was
the crowd receptive.
Oh, very, very, very much so. The hall was very full, and I'm very Irish.
Really? What marked it as being particularly Irish for you?
You see, for instance, there was an old man here in the hall, white hair, and he says to me, "Now, Mr. Mbeki, can you tell me, have you heard of James Connolly?" So I said, "Yes." So he says, "Have you read anything by James Connolly?" So I said, "No." "Have you heard of Patrick Pearse?" I said, "Yes." "Have you read anything by Patrick Pearse?" "No." I think he mentioned a couple of other people. And he said to me, at the end of the meeting, "I'm going to give you a list of books to read. Because you need to understand the liberation struggle in Ireland, which has gone on for many centuries. Because I think that you must learn some lessons from our struggle, which are going to be important for you in South Africa." So indeed I said, "Fine." I'm saying it was important because you could only get that discussion, that kind of discussion here in Ireland, if you did anti-apartheid meetings in England, as we did. I mean, you'd go to a meeting and they would be asking you questions about what pensions do black people get, what pensions do white people get, that kind of question. Legitimate questions and so on. But here at Cork, the question was, what lessons can you draw from the Irish liberation struggle in order to defeat that regime in South Africa? You would never meet that kind of question in England. But here you would.
It's fascinating.
So it was, I'm saying, it was very Irish.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. I am Michael Brooks. We are broadcasting live from Brooklyn, USA, where left is best as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist, and could be a big night for him, David Griscom.
I'm feeling good tonight.
Oh yeah, you feeling good, huh?
Pretty good.
Like a young insurgent Genovese family. Trying to get some new numbers rackets going in Gambino family territory. On tonight's program, Professor Richard Wolff joins us, legendary Marxist economist, founder of Democracy at Work, host of the Economic Update, professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, visiting professor at the New School in New York City. He's here. We're talking about why you need Marx to understand Brexit, where he fits in the Marxist tradition, and the GM layoffs, how they fit into far-right populist hype. Plus, we have a shout-out, Amazon strikes across Europe, a Griscom economic minute, it might be his last, Erik Erikson has waddled out back into center stage to defend Pinochet as another disgusting alt-right meme becomes a mainstream talking point. Kenneth Roth, he's the head of the Human Rights Watch, and well, he could write a report himself on what we're going to do to him tonight, because he wrote one of the most disgusting, stupid tweets imaginable. And speaking of disgusting, stupid tweets and stupid, disgusting positions, we've got to visit Chuck Schumer in his typical moral failings, strategic blunders, and tactical timidity. We'll get to that and much, much more. Plus a Matt Leck regulate, of course, in the postgame. What is Mondragon? What is democracy at work? What's a post-capitalist economy? All that and much, much more on tonight's Michael Brooks show. Let's start, though, by focusing on Northern Ireland. Theresa May, the shambolic far-right British UK Prime Minister, has released a draft of her agreement with the European Union. And among other things, the agreement, which will satisfy no one, punts on the issue of an open border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. This is, of course, the mainstay of the Good Friday Agreement, which was agreed to in 1998 and brought a peace to Northern Ireland, which has been in effect for 20 years. A major part of this agreement was that the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, because of the European Union open borders policy, was essentially non-existent. It was non-existent. So that those who wanted to remain a part of Ireland, remain a part of the remain a part of the United Kingdom of the UK, could feel and stay within Northern Ireland, within the UK. Those who wanted reunification with Ireland as a whole, did not have a militarized, repressive border to navigate. This agreement punts this issue, so it's not an immediate concern for sort of reigniting the troubles in Ireland, but it does point to a longer history here of imperialism, colonialism, national liberation, and socialism and supranational structures which haven't been resolved yet. Let's look at a little bit of Irish history here. Of course, people go back to the Irish potato famine, a choice of capitalism, a choice of British occupiers, no natural event that led to mass suffering and uprisings, which of course led to an abolishment of local political authorities in Ireland. This led to a growth of various Irish movements and Irish socialists, people like James Connolly, who fused together an effort at national self-determination with socialist politics. And this politics is framed usually in a United States audience as being as simple as Protestant versus Catholic. And while that's, of course, a major part of the tensions, there was also class conflict embedded from the beginning, as Protestants were accorded class privilege in line with British occupation, and the Catholics were repressed. There were various cycles of uprising, repression, and this articulation of a fusion of national liberation with socialist politics, which would parallel anti-British, anti-French, and other anti-colonial movements across the globe. In the late 60s and 70s, there would be the beginning of the Troubles, Bloody Sunday, a British massacre which killed nonviolent demonstrators, led to the emergence of a modern Irish Republican movement. Leaders like Gerry Adams and Adam McGuinness would participate in paramilitary campaigns against not only British occupying forces, but also Protestant paramilitaries, and definitely engage in actions that targeted civilians at times. There's no question about that. This movement, though, was a response to a violence that already existed and was embedded as a part of the British occupation. In the 1980s, the repression intensified under Margaret Thatcher. Fast forward to the 1990s, and a peace process began, a multi-party negotiation with unionist loyalists, as well as members of the Sinn Féin, the political arm of the IRA, negotiating with Tony Blair's Labour government, led to the creation of the Good Friday Accords, which have sort of produced significant outcomes in terms of reducing the violence. During the period of the Troubles, over 3,000 people died from fighting in that particular conflict from the 70s through the 90s. The IRA decommissioned, which was getting rid of its weapons in 2005. And while there is still a huge amount of social and religious division in Ireland, this agreement, with the assistance of the transnational superstructure of the European Union, has produced significant results. And now, as Jeremy Corbyn's going to outline in this clip here, of course, that would have been threatened and still could be threatened despite this punt in the May negotiations with the EU.
Do you think in the context of British-Irish relations and Brexit, that British-Irish relations have been allowed to become damaged by Brexit?
If we pursue Brexit, which ends up with a hard border between the Republic and Northern Ireland, then quite clearly those relations are severely damaged. A lot of Irish trade is with the UK. Britain is obviously a very important trading partner with Ireland. There's massive numbers of Irish people living in Britain. There is a common travel area, which of course would be unaffected by any of this. But I do think those relations will be damaged unless we pursue a Brexit which does give us a customs union which would guarantee tariff-free trade.
The far-right parties in Ireland, including the DUP, which props up this far-right UK government, have reacted with panic and opposition to May's, what they call Theresa May's capitulation, in terms of punting on the issue and keeping Northern Ireland within a customs union, which they see not only as a punt on this major part of a delicate peace, but in fact sort of putting the Northern Irish within the Eurozone, within the European Union, one step closer to that Irish unification. Those on the left, Sinn Féin and other political parties, have seen this temporary punting as the best case scenario of a catastrophic situation in terms of what's available. But the broader struggle here is going to continue to be this reconciling of an Irish tradition of republicanism and self-determination with a socialist, class-oriented, liberatory politics that can deliver for not only the Irish people, but connect with a broader struggle against austerity across the Eurozone, and might in fact even connect with the serious socialist plans, democratic socialist plans that Jeremy Corbyn and John MacDonald have for the United Kingdom. And in that type of politics, the first thing that needs to be reaffirmed and supported in the European Union is the incredible accomplishment of open borders, while there's a common struggle and fight against the austerity which has been implemented to police and terrorize workers across the continent, but undermined and destabilized an incredibly hard-fought peace in Northern Ireland and elsewhere across the Eurozone. I just thought it was really interesting, that Thabo Mbeki clip, in light for the cold open, in light of thinking of Ireland really as a colonial subject within the Eurozone, and also, which it literally is, it has been historically, and also for all of the flaws and the problems of the IRA and Irish republicanism, the reality is that if you go back historically and you look at Protestant loyalist paramilitaries, there's, they're signifying their connection with Rhodesia, apartheid South Africa, where the IRA was, as an example, I believe Jerry Adams was a pallbearer at Nelson Mandela's funeral. So they do have those global connections to liberation movements and do fit in that broader tradition. And they've sort of re-engaged somewhat in modern politics with an anti-austerity agenda.
It's very interesting if you look at the history of Ireland and also even Wales, how a lot of the tactics that the British used in colonialism, for example, language laws and trying to disrupt local cultures, basically imprisoning people for speaking their local languages, were really developed in Ireland and Wales. In Wales, for example, there was a really interesting thing called the Welsh Knot, which is if a student was ever found to speak their own language, they were tied around this very heavy block around their neck, school children. And because there were such stringent rules against speaking Welsh in Wales, the only really good, because the British are so meticulous in the records that they keep, one of the few good written records of the Welsh language for the period of very serious British colonialism in Wales is through curse words, because people would curse the British people in Welsh, and it would be very, very damaging, and that would be written down, of course, in the legal documents. So a lot of linguists go to look at that to find developments and changes in Welsh language.
That's awesome. That's awesome. What do you got here, Matt?
So one of my favorite authors, Richard Slotkin, who writes about the mythology of sort of the American frontier.
Right.
Basically, he talks about the parallels between what happened with the Native Americans in America and the Irish, and basically Cromwell, right?
Yeah.
The English are the through line through all this. And so he writes, it is interesting to note that the adoption of similar policies by the Puritans colonizing in Ulster and on the Celtic border in Scotland, where systematic assaults were made on Celtic tribalism, native barbaric myth historians were forbidden to sing, isolated clans were exterminated, and the rest of the population was ravaged. Cromwell even attempted to establish a, quote, wild Irish reservation in Western Ireland. His brutal conquest of Ireland seems to have been conceived, in part at least, as the English equivalent of the Spanish jihads against the Indians, which Cromwell had read about in the book dedicated to him by the nephew of John Milton. So yeah, this is just this whole colonial milieu of it set deep roots, I guess we could say.
Yeah, it did. And a lot of those things were paralleled and prototyped in Ireland, and still fit, just in terms of like where these various Irish factions fit in terms of global politics. And also the, fascinating, like another place too, where when you do make a peace, how much do you have to make peace with? Because everybody has blood in their hands, and everybody's done some really vicious shit. And I think that's another sort of thing, the sort of pragmatic and strategic part of me also looks at, which is like some of the debates here that get so vicious over such literally zero stakes. We can go and look at, other parallels where in order to actually establish like people no longer being kneecapped or murdered or having a significant upgrade in political representation, had to actually literally forgive and do business with people who had murdered each other, and in that case, Martin McGuinness and David Trimble, Trimble's just this horrific, totally far right, almost Pat Robertson like figure, but the truth is their ability to form a friendship and strike an agreement in Good Friday has saved a lot of lives and created a delicate balance, which was certainly an upgrade from the pure repression that existed in Catholic communities under British occupation before.
And it's it's definitely significant, and it's something that's very important for people to remember when we see this peace process just in the balance because of these Brexit negotiations and just like the utter incompetence that we've seen so far. It is something that's very frightening.
David Cameron just being like, "Oh fuck, the referendum,"
and even how much Jeremy Corbyn gets maligned in the UK press for having any just like the mildest sympathy with like the Irish struggle.
Right.
It's something that he very much just says peace is a good thing, and to have peace we need to be having dialogue with people, and it's something that we really need to make sure that we don't lose if things start to boil over. Hopefully they won't, but I mean, given the context of this Brexit debate, I don't know. It's been very frightening to watch.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and especially like I have to say, like Jeremy Corbyn, Good Friday is something that you got to give Tony Blair props for. He negotiated and quite rightly early on met with Jerry Adams and David McGuinness and had a political process. And all that Jeremy Corbyn gets smeared for is having that position like 15 years before Blair did. So this retroactive, Oh, no. All of a sudden that means, because of course we know what it really points to, which is that this is a guy who actually has genuine sympathy for anti-colonialist struggles globally. This is a guy who spent some time, by the way, Jeremy Corbyn, look it up, apropos of this show, spent some time, I believe, in Michael Manley's Jamaica in the 70s. That's going to have some influence on how he looks at things. And that's going to relate to Ireland as well. All right, speaking of it, let's get to the shout-out. Do we have the Danarchy ready? I know we haven't done it in a little while. Let's get to the shout-out. Shout-out.
Creepy.
Shout-out.
Weird. I think that's creepy. It's incredible.
Shout-out.
This is crazy.
Shout-out.
This is out of control.
Shout-out.
That's creepy.
Shout-out.
That's weird. Creepy. Weird. Crazy. This is crazy. This is out of control. This is weird.
Props to
I don't know, that kind of. That's amazing.
Just like to do my little remix to it.
I want to get a Lava Jato t-shirt.
What was Jimmy Dore at on Brexit?
I don't know where he's at on Brexit.
Where was he, though?
I don't know. It's probably like, it's fucking rebelling. I mean, here's the thing. I'll do one more tangent. There is a left case against Brexit. It just wasn't what won Brexit, right? Like the conditions on the ground were a far-right, xenophobic, reactionary campaign. To the extent to which there's an economic agenda, it's to turn the UK into a country more like Singapore and slash the social safety net.
The left Brexit critique wasn't on the menu.
Right. So, okay, like I'm aware that people like Jeremy Corbyn were totally right about the Eurozone's neoliberal market rules. 100%. That wasn't what Brexit was. Okay. Across the Eurozone for Black Friday, workers at Amazon factories went on strike. And I think do we have some video for this clip? Thousands of Amazon workers staged Black Friday strike just in time for the online, I'm quoting now, just in time for the online bonanza. Amazon warehouse employees across Europe went on strike and are staging strikes today, according to UNI Global Union. Workers are demanding better worker conditions, wages, and protesting Amazon's refusal to negotiate with them. We are not robots, the strikers are reporting. This is from a report, I believe, in Business Insider. And we have a clip that if David Griscom sent to Matt, we will play. The workers striked in countries including Spain, Italy, and Germany. And we've talked about this. I mean, Amazon is in the headlines here because of the scam that has brought them to places, to New York and to Virginia, the massive taxpayer giveaway to this predatory, dangerous company. And these are examples of what we all need to do in various forms. It can't just be workers there. It has to be everybody that is committed to breaking up this company. Its supply chain is fundamentally antithetical to the environment, to sustainability, to humans, and to labor. Let's watch. This is something that the GMB union put out to coalesce with their Black Friday Amazon workers strikes. All solidarity and shout out to them. This is amazing.
Amazon, wir sind keine Roboter.
Amazon, vi är inte robotar.
Amazon, noi non siamo robot. Amazon, no somos robots.
Amazon,
we are not robots.
Amazon,
we are not robots.
The global fight to get Amazon to treat its workers with respect is growing. We're seeing this, we're feeling this. Amazon, we are not robots. We're going to fight and we're going to win.
That's a great piece. And when you think of it, think of the cold open from last week of Jeff Bezos talking about his supply chains and how exciting it is. Is this the type of like just degenerate, imploded humanity you want dictating the rules of your economy and how we all live?
It's weird how I imagine how this would be received by most people is, yeah, we all get it. Amazon sucks. Even by people who aren't plugged into like left-wing podcasts, right? Like there's a genuine I think, monopoly sentiment, and Amazon gets it a lot, even from people who subscribe to it. But if you made this exact same thing like 6 years ago, people would think you're being way over the top. Oh, you think that human beings need to tell a company they're not robots? Like, you guys are really...
Yeah, you guys are being a little extreme.
A bit dramatic. We are not robots. It's horrifying when you think about it. This is the battlefield.
This is the battlefield. That is horrifying.
Because that's really the Amazon innovation, right?
Right.
It's just creating a massive supply chain that you can squeeze as much as possible, including things like the 2-day shipping and just like the focus on speed really is crushing, to human spirit, my lord. And it's something that's been it's exciting to see these kind of protests, because this isn't the first time that we've shouted out protests across Europe against Amazon either on this show. And I think this kind of increased militant activity against the company is going to only increase, especially now. I know in New York and DC, a lot of people are already getting organized, preparing for what's going to come.
And we need to support the Kim legislation in New York City. Everybody in New York State. If you live in New York State, call your legislator immediately. I look it up. I believe it's Ronald Kim. I should have this in front of me, but we're going to be talking about this regularly. His bill would take away the billions of dollars, I believe it's a $2 billion giveaway to Amazon, and use that money to relieve over 1 million New Yorkers of their student debts. It is like the functional equivalent of like, I don't know, giving a lollipop back to a baby. I cannot think of a better use of money. The thing Cuomo and de Blasio are pushing, let's take all your money, give it to one of the most rich, exploitive, dangerous companies on the planet, have them come here, fuck up our subways even more, create a new geography of housing affordability crisis, and generate a handful of jobs and a few good union buildings for a brief limited of time. Okay, fine. How about instead of that, we take a chunk out of the student debt crisis, which is one of the premier social, economic, political crises of our time. And I really wish that those of us who are toiling with student debts would at times sort of formalize that, like, when we've defaulted at times because we're too broke to pay anything, that's a political act. It's a political reality. It's not a personal moral failing. This is a mass exploitation and abuse of generations of people. And the money to relieve those people, even as Betsy DeVos is working her way through the bureaucracy quite efficiently to make student debt relief a legal impossibility. We have an opportunity in this state to take money that could be diverted literally from us to Amazon to further exploit us. Instead, take out a student debt relief, which will, of course, have a huge ancillary benefit in terms of, first and foremost, people's lives and well-being. But if you're thinking about the economic end, home construction, rent, business investment, and a million other ancillary benefits. It's beyond a no-brainer. And literally all anybody should ever ask Andrew Cuomo and certainly Bill de Blasio about ever. Do you support the Kim legislation? It's a pre-fucking no-brainer. All right, guys, we're gonna talk to you a little bit about TMBS and, of course, the TMBS live show. When we have some, are we gonna bed some more DJ Danarchy for this, Matt? So, just want to say thank you. We are, as of showtime, 1,750. So we're 250 away from our next goal, which is 2,000 patrons. And we released a couple of we unlocked a couple of illicit histories. We had one more that we're going to unlock, which is an interview from last year with Ronnie Kasrils, who is a South African revolutionary, intelligence minister, fought alongside Mandela. He actually literally, when Nelson Mandela was first put a warrant for his arrest in the early 60s, in South Africa, he was called the Black Pimpernel by the press. And Ronnie Kasrils was called the Red Pimpernel because he was a communist. It was a fascinating interview. It was his 80th birthday last week, and exactly the type of content that you get as a patron of TMBS. Historical deep dives, theory reading, a vibrant, active Discord community, and, of course, all of the incredibly fun, high audience participatory post games We want you to become a patron and help us continue to sustain, expand our work. We're passionate and serious about this. If you're watching this tonight and you haven't already, subscribe to the Michael Brooks Show on YouTube. We're putting out a lot more clips here, and we want to use this to expand the show.
Yeah, put us over 10K. We're right at 9.9, so.
Yeah, put us over 10K. And this is obviously, you know, people tell us a lot, like this is a good way of easing people into the content of the show. Global leftism, solidarity with Brazil, the nature of the global economy today, what is a real intellectual dark web and what isn't a real intellectual dark web, us having a lot of fun, us synthesizing and transcending the race versus economics debate and the future of the left. This is definitely a really unique space on YouTube, so subscribe, spread the word. On February 1st, I don't know if you want to get this up on screen. We've been starting to plan out and map out what we are going to do at the first live show at the Bell House, the first Michael Brooks live show at the Bell House, Friday, February 1st. I'm incredibly excited about this. So far, of course, we have crew, Bhaskar Sunkara, Alona Minkowski, Trevor Bellew, T of Champagne Sharks, Bhaskar, founder of Jacobin Magazine, Alona Minkowski, great talk show host. You've seen her on MSNBC. You've seen her on a million different outlets, former host of HuffPost Live and Salon. We are going to have audience contests. We're going to have an impression contest. You want to come up on stage and test out your Obama impression with me? Go for it. Matt and David, what are your visions for the live show, guys? By the way, I should tell you, I was talking with the agent the other day, and he said, especially for this time, because we're still a couple of months out, the ticket sales are going fast. So we are going to, we're on the move. Matt, what do you have in mind for the live show?
Well, I guess if we're going to do the impression.
Yeah, definitely going to do the impressions.
I mean, I guess I'm going to have to dust off my Matt Taibbi impression.
Could you give people a tease of your Matt Taibbi impression? No, I want a tease of the Matt Taibbi impression. It's so good.
It's hard.
I need a tease.
That I can't.
All right, let me try. Can I just try to set you up for it?
Yeah, you can try.
Matt Taibbi joining us now for the Gulag segment.
No, I can't do because I can just do the vocal fry. I need to work on.
Do the vocal fry. You can't do the full impression. All right. Well, so guys, that's where you get your tickets to the Michael Brooks live show. We'll see you on February 1st, and of course, Patreon.com/TMBS. I should say, entering the building now is the great Professor Richard Wolff. David has fled to the bathroom for all of his slick talk about how he wasn't worried about it. So what we'll do is we'll get to Professor Wolff in a few minutes, but first we have to get to your segment, David. The segment that has brought infamy as well as a certain danger to David Griscom's life. Have you ever read about the Lucchese family, David?
No. Are you going to enlighten me?
Well, they're a smaller family than the Gambino family. And sometimes what happens is the Lucchese guys would try to move into turf that was not allocated for them. And Carlo Gambino, as an example, maybe John Gotti in the late 80s, would have a response to the Lucchese family's mischief. This was not a prime family, if you know what I'm saying. So I think there's a similar dynamic here in the sense of you being Lucchese and Professor Wolff being Gambino. If that makes sense to you.
Next time you have to give me a Texas example, but I think I get it.
A Texas example?
Yeah.
I don't do Texas examples on this show. You know that.
I know.
All right. David Griscom with the Griscom Economic Minute.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
We've been talking a lot in the past few weeks about one of the favorite tricks of corporate America, which has been stock buybacks. But I really wanted to talk about something else that I've been looking at and have sort of made me chuckle a little bit when I was looking at the balance sheets. So, you know, throughout the era of cheap money and the Trump tax cuts, corporate America has had plenty of money to play with. Of course, they're using this money to seek profits rather than improve the lives of workers or any kind of the trickle-down nonsense that you hear from right-wingers. So this, of course, has gone on during a period of historic stagnation of wages for American workers and also global workers in the large part. And, you know, we've also talked a lot about the role of the Fed and the government in increasing the assets prices of the rich as part of the recovery from the economic crisis. So I really want to talk about this, though, because capital expenditures have actually been up over the past couple of years. And that's primarily when a company is buying and improving their productive assets. But there's been a major shift over the past 15 to 20 years in what major corporations are using their money to buy, how corporations are spending their capital expenditure. Intellectual property made up 52% of all new investment. So that means...
So we're talking pharmaceutical patents, movie rights? What are we talking about?
Yes, so we're talking pharmaceutical patents. We're talking about patents and intellectual property in general. So basically what that means is, so for all of our free marketeers out there, this is basically an organization buying a legal right to a product and shutting out competition from being able to produce the same kind of product, or preventing, you know, other kind of innovations and owning an idea. Often not, these things are bought up and they're not even used. They're used to prevent future competition.
Apparently, super producer Matt Leck got drunk at Thanksgiving and ranted about Disney doing this to some people. Is that right, Matt?
That's accurate, yeah.
That's correct, okay.
But it's important for us to remember that more and more we're seeing a shift in our economy in the United States, especially from the physical to the intangible. You know, it reminds me a lot of something that Marx wrote in the manifesto, actually. It's that all that is solid melts into air. We're moving from actual factories and actual production into brand awareness and brand recognition. We're moving from actual physical products to something that to digital products, what should be something that's infinitely accessible, but more and more being locked up behind a paywall. What you're seeing are companies like Apple and Google fighting harder and harder to get more and more intellectual property so that they can dominate the digital marketplace, so that they can dominate the new intellectual world that is open through the internet. So what we're seeing more and more money being spent on is new and clever ways for the rich to be able to shore up higher profits from the infrastructure that has been created in our society, while the working people are completely left in the dust. Because owning a bunch of intellectual property might be very good for the shareholders of Google, but it does not help the actual working people who are still waiting for wage increases or basically any kind of more comfortable living in this country.
So it's interesting to talk about the tension between an economy that, well, there's a lot of tension here, but the tension between the idea that ecological resources are infinite, which they aren't, right?
No.
But they're treated as such. And then these intellectual products, which actually could be infinite. There's no need to lock intellectual property. That's a
the only limitation
scarcity.
Is the infrastructure,
the
physical infrastructure,
which is actually an ecology question, because the so-called knowledge economy has a huge ecological.
But at the same time, of course, the distribution of information.
That's what I'm saying.
That
you're putting locks on things, which by definition could be totally literally are weightless. Like
and we're seeing, and what has actually, just to double down on that, what has most of this intellectual property law and a lot of the new developments through internet technologies been used for? It's been used to share products, right? Not in a good way, though, in a way that you don't own anything, right? So that you don't own your music, you don't own your movies, you don't even own your computer software anymore. That instead you have to continually pay subscription services and are continually locked in to basically paying, rents to
There was this book
corporations
called The Access Economy, I think it was called, by Jeremy Rifkin, that came out like 15 years ago. And that's what he said, is basically that everything in the future will just be renting.
Yeah, it's sort of an irony and a contradiction of capitalism that that the distribution of goods and services has been opened up in a way that the commodity has moved from like the individual to the public, but it just means that there's more general debt to certain organizations.
Well, David, I think you did a good job, and I
do this every week.
Yeah, I mean, This is awkward for me. I usually feel totally in control of the studio. I don't know what might happen in a couple of minutes, frankly. David Griscom, Economic Minute, doing Texas proud. Okay, we're going to get to, what we'll do is we'll talk about the Eric Erickson stuff and the Chuck Schumer stuff with Professor Wolff. We'll get to that in the postgame. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a brief break, and then we are going to come back with Professor Richard Wolff. He's joining us here. We will be right back on the Michael Brooks Show. Welcome back. Ready? Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Professor Richard D. Wolff. He's a visiting professor at the New School in New York City, the host of the Economic Update, founder of Democracy at Work, and Professor Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Michael, for inviting me, and I'm glad to be here.
So we have a lot to get to, including we have some sound of President Trump that we're going to get to in a second. Do you have anything that you'd like to say to David Griscom before we get going here? I've been concerned that this is a source.
I'm watching every move. I'm waiting for the right moment and hoping that he gets more and more anxiety-ridden as we get closer, because that's what you learn to do in academia. Terrorize. Because you long ago lost the taste for actually exploring things together. So it's a vast game of one-upmanship, and I'm hoping that I can show how well I've mastered this game.
Oh, my. David?
You should look out, because I'm pretty quick.
All right.
Wow. Yes. All right.
Well, like Stormy Daniels said, game on.
Can I have my board, please? All right.
Only she said, game on, tiny.
Did she actually say that?
She did. That was her answer to the last thing Trump said to her. She said, okay, game on, tiny.
Oh, was that, what did he say to her, the last thing? He called her a horse face?
Yeah, I think
that was.
As usual, she got the better of him in that one,
right.
too.
She knows how to manage.
Just like Michelle Wolff a few weeks later did the same.
That was actually really funny, the Michelle Wolff one.
Yeah, she's good.
That one. She was good at that sort of thing. This is President Trump from earlier today speaking to two issues that I think you can I don't even know how to set this guy's clips up anymore. He's at the White House lawn. He's irritated. His cortisol's running through his body. His bluster and his lies. You can always this is sort of mid-range mood. I would say if he was asked this by a black reporter, he would probably go off a lot more. But he's feeling a little tense. This is him on the GM layoffs. And then I think tacked on to the end of this, he's going to also talk about this new climate report as well. And I'd like us to listen to this and then for you to respond, Professor.
I was very tough. I spoke with her when I heard they were closing. And I said, this country's done a lot for General Motors. You better get back in there soon. That's Ohio. And you better get back in there soon. So we have a lot of pressure on them. You have senators. You have a lot of other people. A lot of pressure. They say the Chevy Cruze is not selling well. I say, well, then get a car that is selling well and put it back in. So I think you're going to see something else happen there. But I'm not happy about it. Their car is not selling well. So they'll put something else. I have no doubt that in a not too distant future, they'll put something else. They better put something else in. John, go ahead. I've seen it. I've read some of it, and it's fine. Yeah, I don't believe it. No, I don't believe it. And here's the other thing. You're going to have China and Japan and all of Asia and all of these other countries, addresses our country. Right now, we're at the cleanest we've ever been, and that's very important to me. But if we're clean, but every other place on earth is dirty, that's not so good.
I can't set it up anymore.
No.
Would you like to take that point by point or utterance by utterance?
It is hard. It is. He's kind of one. He exhausts you with the endless flow of this stuff.
Right.
And it's kind of hard to to take it seriously enough to give it the attention to give a proper response. Just a couple. The first, if you listen closely, he's threatening General Motors, which is kind of cute since he can't really do anything. He's already tried to make General Motors behave in a particular way, which didn't work. So the threat is even emptier than it might have been even a year or two ago. And in the end, it's almost plaintive. They better. Right. He hopes. They will. So we're all supposed to wait until the profit-making decisions of a company determine what happens to tens of thousands of people, not just those employed by General Motors, but if you cut back those factories, all the little businesses that feed those factories, inputs, services, you name it, they will all be affected. The communities, cities, and states that are going to lose tax revenue, they're going to cut back on public employees because they don't have the money. Or they'll tax the rest of the people, which will hurt them. I mean, the ramifications of this are staggering, and they go to show what's wrong with the economy. In order to beef up the profits of the General Motors Corporation, they're going to do whatever damage they need to do. Right. In Canada, here, tens of thousands of workers, they don't have to worry about it. They don't have to care for it. The damage will just ramify, but it doesn't show up on their balance sheet, so they don't have to worry. If you remember that 10% of the stockholders own 80% of the shares, we're talking a tiny minority of the people will get a benefit out of a rising stock market if they produce more profits. And at least immediately in the aftermath of GM's announcements, its shares went up nicely. So good for them. Misery. Can you imagine? This is 3 weeks before Christmas. What a Christmas present to this state, to these cities, to these families, to the whole nation. And all this man at the presidency can do is say, I hope, and I've been tough on them, which scares nobody, and I make an empty threat, which is I'm good at. It's really pathetic, the imbalance here between what really runs the system, which is profit calculations, and all of this window dressing fluffery that comes from the political leaders. A courageous president would say, you've got 3 weeks to come up with a plan. If you don't have it, we're nationalizing the plants, and we will make sure that other things are produced there so that these jobs are preserved. This could be done. In a different society, it would be done, and it's only one of many other options that could be undertaken. None of it even comes into the consciousness of our political leaders because they are so slavishly wrapped up in the status quo, in the way the country works, that they can't even think of options other than you better, as if he were a school marm telling children to hang up their coats in the coat room the way they're supposed to.
He would hate that comparison. And Trump would be so upset by that comparison.
And then the other
thing. Not true.
That's right. And the other thing, I mean, his government comes out with a report, which he thinks is just fine, but he doesn't believe it. I mean, it's amazing. He doesn't believe it because it isn't convenient to his political game.
Right.
You know, most of what this guy is doing, and it's been true all along, is what in other countries is called political theater. He is performing a role designed to keep a small but significant part of the American population bubbling with happiness because he's kind of giving the finger to the old politics. That's what they want. The details are not that interesting. They are interested in this rejection of whatever it is that the establishment wants, and that he's going to do that. And you know, the only end game to that, which I think ought to scare people, to tell you the truth, the only end game of that kind of a politics is a real threat. And that threat is already there implicitly, and I believe it will become explicit in the next few months, which is, as he is hemmed in, whether it's by the Mueller investigation or by the downturn in the economy that's already underway, he is going to have fewer and fewer options. And the final card he has to play is, you better do what I need and want, otherwise I'm going to unleash that 25% of the people I've been cultivating for all my adult life, and I'm going to tell them it's okay to really go to town to make this place unlivable.
Yeah.
You know, he basically did that to the Republicans during the primary.
Right.
You mess with me, and I'm going to unleash those people who barely tolerate you as it is, and then you can kiss all elections goodbye. It was a straight out. Then he did the same to the Democrats, and now he's going to do the same to the rest of us, all of us. You don't go with me, and you're going to see behavior that makes Charlottesville or any of the other things we've already seen look like picnics. I'm going to encourage them. I'm going to validate them. I'm going to call them to save me from your awful clutches. And then the people who run this society are going to be confronted. Is he worse letting him go, or would it be dangerous to call his bluff? What would happen if we did? And, you know, he wouldn't be the first leader of that type to win that game, to say, I'm less trouble for you than what will happen to you if you mess with me.
Do you think, yeah, and that actually makes sense. That's why a group specifically like the Proud Boys is really relevant to this, because they have plausible deniability. I mean, it's ridiculous, but they set up plausible deniability. And that is why, in terms of, we're nationalists. We're not racists. We're Western chauvinists. We're not white nationalists. That's why they get to go to the Republican Club in the Upper East Side. Right. And that's why you actually can see the formation there. Because I'm mostly of the school of kind of, don't give these groups more light and more heat than they deserve. And because they are kind of amalgamations of losers and so on, and forget it. But at the same time, that specific dynamic you're outlining and that specific group, you can see the formation of that kind of paramilitary sort of, and in most fascist or authoritarian regimes, like maybe, I mean, my understanding is even like the mass murder of communists in Indonesia, a lot of it was subcontracted to gangs and mafias. So that's the kind
and
of...
And if you do the history of Germany, in 1932, Hitler was very clear. He said to the industrialists of Germany, you really have a choice. You either give me the power, bring me in, which they, by the way, decided to do in January of 1933. He walks in with their blessing. Because if you don't, you'll either have the left wing, which was picking up half the vote in Germany, socialists and communists, or you'll have me unleash my people. And then you're going to discover that you got nobody. You're just the industrialist. You're a small group of people. The left has the mass of half the workers, and I have the other half, the right wing. And between us, if we give you both the figurative finger, you're reduced to what you are, which is a tiny minority, and you'll lose everything. They scared the pants off them, and they went with him because the alternative was even scarier for them.
I want to ask how that relates to Brazil in a second, but I would be remiss if, I mean, there's going to be an economic downturn. Break it down.
Yes.
What's happening?
It's really interesting to me because if you read the financial press, particularly in the last 3 weeks when the stock market has been wildly gyrating around, if you read the financial press, and I mean the Financial Times, I mean Bloomberg Service, I mean the usual Wall Street Journal, all that, you'll see that a huge number, probably a majority of commentators are simply discussing when the economic downturn exactly will hit, not whether it will, just when. Whereas the mainstream mass media in the normal front page of the newspaper and so forth is acting like we've got a great recovery going here and it's really pretty good and we're the strongest economy and the rest of the world really is. And the disconnect between the two parts of
David's been saying
the same.
David's been very bullish on the economy.
Exactly. That's
he's very.
That's where, there we
David's
go.
like, look, I'm a socialist, but I'm just so confident in this economy right now. So it's been a source of tension on the show. I just wanted to let you know.
It's a funny disconnect. Even by American standards, there hasn't been in the past quite this much of a disconnect as I see going on now. And I guess that's because you have, partly because of Mr. Trump. I mean, he has put so much emphasis for the first 2 years of his term on the economy being strong, since little else is. And he could tell a story that his tax cut last December was a crucial part of this, and so isn't he a great master economic policymaker and all of that. So it lent itself to his kind of megalomania. And so maybe that keeps it going. You have to keep the story going because he can't take ownership now that it's going down. He only wanted the ride on the way up.
What's contributing to it going down?
Well, a lot of things. The American economy, well, let me tell you a story, a personal story that might interest your viewers and so forth. Because I went to the elite universities that I went to here in the United States, I know a lot of the people who went to those places. It's a small group, and we kind of know each other. You know, my classmate, I got my PhD at Yale, and my classmate was Janet Yellen, who went on to be the head of the Federal Reserve, and you know, Stiglitz and Krugman. These are all people I have something to do with. And I get together with various of them from time to time for coffee or dinner. And we don't agree on how we got into the current situation, and we sure don't agree on how to get out of it. But the thing that we do agree on, which we have noticed over the last couple years, surprises all of us. The following sentence we all agree on. This is the worst condition of the American economy in our lifetimes. Okay, so what's going on? Well, there's the big picture and then the little picture. The big picture. Capitalism was born and became big and powerful in very particular parts of the world. Starts in England, spreads to continental Europe, then to North America, then to Japan. And from there, it's become global. But it concentrated its factories, its offices, its shopping centers in its places of origin, North America, Western Europe, Japan, until 30, 40 years ago, at which point the development of the jet engine, the development of the internet changed everything. Capitalists, because they had been concentrated in those places, Western Europe, North America, Japan, had to come to terms with the working classes that made their factories run, made their offices work, and they cut a deal. And the deal was, we're going to make a great deal of money, and we're going to give you some. We're going to raise your wages, so do your job. Don't give us a lot of grief. And it worked. It worked for a good long while. By the 1970s, it dawned on capitalists, wow, we're paying high wages built up over a century and a half, but we could move to another part of the world. With the internet, we could supervise production as clearly in China as we used to supervise it across the street in Hoboken. We don't need to be in Hoboken. More importantly, we don't have to pay the wages the way we do in Hoboken, because it turns out in Shanghai, the wages are 10% of what they are here. Plus, we can get out of environmental controls and 50 other constraints that have been built up over the years. And with the jet engine, we can get our senior management there in a matter of hours. With modern transportation, we can bring all the stuff we produce there back here. And even with the cost of transport, we can still make a bundle because the wages are so small. Okay, bottom line of this. There has been a massive shift in the center, the growth areas of capitalism. They're not here. They're over there. Yeah. And yes, we still have some here, the information agency, the high tech. Even that is moving pretty fast. China is contesting almost across the board on those things. But the bottom line is capitalism, and this is the stark part of it, has abandoned its areas of origin. It maybe wants to live there. It wants to have good restaurants there. It wants to party there. But all the production, that's growing elsewhere. That's the wages of Chinese workers have gone way up in the last 10 years while they've stagnated here. There's no contest between what's happening to those people and what's happening here. The American press doesn't talk about it, but everybody who pays attention knows. So I think part of what you're seeing is the belated accommodation of American capitalism and the American people who still don't want to face it, that the system they are so loyal to hasn't been loyal to them. It's packed up its stuff and it's making a bundle. That's why the shirts you wear and the appliances you use, they all come 10,000 miles, polluting the ocean along the way because it's more profitable. And this is going to mean a long-term decline in the standard of living here. The jobs aren't here. American young people are discovering it. They've borrowed more than ever to get a degree because they need it to get a job, but the jobs they can get are not very good, and they're not secure, and they don't have the benefits, and they don't earn the income that'll even allow you to pay back the loans, let alone get married, have children, or do any of the other things comprising the so-called American dream. And I think it's therefore an adjustment process that is going to be punctuated by economic downturns. And you can stall it off by giving people debt. They can buy stuff they can't afford because they can borrow. But we reached the first limit of that in 2008, and everybody expects we're about to reach the next limit because the crash of 2008 had to be dealt with. It was by dropping interest rates virtually to zero, which was an invitation to every government, every corporation, and any people who could still do it to borrow like crazy. They've been doing that. I don't know if your viewers watch this, but the level of corporate debt is higher now than it was just before the crash of 2008. Ditto for governments. So we are once again loading up this debt-ridden economy. We have no idea how fast that will explode once the downturn begins, whether it's in the automobile business, which is clearly having trouble, or 10 other businesses. That's why the majority of the conventional business press knows that we didn't learn much. We thought we learned from 1929 how to prevent it. Well, 2008 showed us we didn't. And now we're back to the conditions pretty much just before 2008, as if we didn't learn anything out of that kind of crash. So everybody's wondering not whether it's going to happen, but exactly when and from which corner the troubles will come. And Lord help us, if you see the difficulties Mr. Trump and his government are in now, take away the economic boomlet that he had for 2 years and replace it with an economic downturn. It's not even a question of how bad it'll be. It'll be what happens when Mr. Trump loses the support of the very people who have been supporting him till now. Nobody is going to be as angry at Mr. Trump, sorry, interesting slip. No one's going to be as angry at Mr. Trump as the people who believed him and feel then betrayed or undone and having been had by this.
I heard the interview. It was fine. It was fine.
Yes.
Then, if I could put into play here, then, and you just actually gifted me a copy of your book, which maybe you could, is it Contested Economies?
Right.
Contested. So, 2008 and what you're outlining here, maybe I would like to dive into that more, because, especially I think from the perspective of this show and other shows like it, because if you look at 2008, okay, there's the deregulatory, neoliberal, classical, whatever the hell you call it, that happened in the 80s and the 90s, and which, a lot of people would, the conventional sort of Keynesian center-left narrative is that deregulation led to 2008. And I think in a relative sense, that's obvious. But then there's this, so having these relative or very important but contextual arguments about how you manage capitalism, basically, which is, do you deregulate the banks or do you toughen up on them but you still have trading and so on and so forth? And then say you come in with a Marxist analysis and then a perspective that, to me, I don't know, terminology like post-capitalism or democratizing the economy. How does that fit into that relative argument here between, and specifically, could regulation safeguard us from some of these crises or some of these boom and bust cycles so endemic to capitalism itself that no matter how it's managed, it will happen one way or another, if that makes sense?
Good question, but I think in a way, history's already answered that question. Capitalism, if you date it, end of the 17th or 18th century, comes into England and spreads the way we mentioned before. Wherever it has settled, and by now it has settled basically everywhere, wherever it has settled, all the empirical studies show, on the average, but every 4 to 7 years, there's an economic downturn. Some of them are short and shallow. Others of them are long and deep. 1929 was long and deep. 2008 was long and deep. But between the end of the Great Depression, 1941, and the beginning of the current disaster, 2008, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is the entity that keeps track of this for us, counts 11 downturns. So some of them we barely felt. They weren't that big. Others of them, like 1974, were pretty hefty. And then the big ones, right? So during that time, human beings, understandably, were irritated. I'm being polite here. They were outraged.
You could
Every
say
4 to
pissed
off,
anything.
badly. That's
Yes.
right. Every 4 to 7 years, you lose your job. Or even if you don't, your Aunt Sadie does, or your neighbor does, affecting the neighborhood's housing stock. I mean, you're constantly worried about it. You're anxious about it. It hits periodically. It's pretty awful. And people wanted something done about it. And basically, Keynesian economics is the response, in this case of John Maynard Keynes, saying, okay, you're right. This is awful. This is an unstable economic system. When I teach it in the
Boom
class,
and bust.
Yeah, and when I teach it in the class, at this point in the lecture, I kind of lean across the podium and I look at the students and I allow a pregnant pause. I'm a student of comedians and I've learned a little bit. And I say, if you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. Why are you staying here?
This is true.
And they sit there, and in a moment, with a little thing like that, you can get the idea across better than long-winded lectures. Anyway, the truth of it is, capitalists have tried to deal with this problem. They know it. I mean, they know it as well as everybody else, and they're scared because in those moments of downturn is when people begin to question the system too. Look at us now. The last 4 or 5 years, people like me have an audience in America I never had before because of the crash of 2008 and all of its ramifications. People are interested in a critical perspective. I'm sure part of your audience is drawn because you're explaining things that they want to understand because things are not working out real well. Okay, so the system has had every incentive to deal with this problem, to overcome this instability, to figure out with Keynesian notions, monetary policy, quantitative easing, fiscal expansion.
Gordon Brown. I always remember Gordon Brown saying, he said, we have fixed boom and bust.
That's
he actually
right.
said that.
That's right.
Before
my teachers used to tell me that.
Gordon Brown said that the new Labor government had fixed
it
boom
all.
and bust. That's
my teacher.
That's quite a statement.
My teacher at Yale in macroeconomics, which is what this sort of field is called, was a man named James Tobin, who got a Nobel Prize in economics. Now, he said that to us in class. He said, we have conquered that problem. Well, the truth is they didn't. They tried to. They tried everything they could. And the fact is, here we are, still in the aftermath of one of the second greatest crash, 2008, worried about the next one. We haven't been able to do it. So history, in a way, has answered. This is way deeper a built-in mechanism of capitalism.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, that all these programs and policies, look, they may have made them a little less serious on occasion, but the conservatives like to point out, but on other occasions what the government did when it stepped in actually made it worse. And there's something to that. But more important than arguing to make it better, make it worse, the answer is it didn't solve the problem. Sometimes it made it better. Sometimes it may have made it worse. But the bottom line is we are living with an economic system whose instability ought to have made people long ago be able to ask and honestly debate, maybe the problem isn't fixing this refrigerator. Maybe it's time to get a new one,
Stop negotiating with the roommate.
Yeah, after you've brought after you've brought the refrigerator repairman or woman to your house 15 times, and now you're calling him or her again, and this time they look at you with that sad look and they say, look, I'm not in the business of selling refrigerators. I'm not here to make money. I'm just telling you, you'll have to give me $462 to fix this, and you'll be on the phone calling me back in 3 weeks. You maybe ought to think that you can do better than this refrigerator. You need a new one. And, a rational society would have said, maybe our problem isn't fixing this instability, but getting an economic system that doesn't work this way.
Well, why are we, we'll weave other things in, but this is just getting to the heart of it, I guess. I mean, or in fact we are. Why are we so resistant to that? It's an overused quote, but sometimes overused quotes are overused because they describe something. Correct. And that's easier to picture the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? Yeah. Even if you grew up, I was talking about this with Daniel Bessner on this show the other day, and we're both in our mid-30s. When we came up in the 90s, there was not even, even the idea of having like good redistributive tax policies, because at least in my case, I knew what growing up in a family that was poor was considered so radically antithetical to ethics, common sense, economics. And in fact, the narrative that you just told about how capitalism is spreading and we're moving from the centers in the West and the centers are getting redefined to China and India, well, that was all like Thomas Friedman books. And that was supposed to be great because apparently, I don't know, we would just make internet companies here or something.
That's right.
And none of it's working. And there's also a whole new wave of primitive accumulation in Africa, which has enormous environmental damage and a whole other round of almost colonial competition and human suffering between the United States and China and France. Why can't we picture a way out of that predicament? And when you talk about it, maybe this is a good way of also, you could start putting what part of the Marxist tradition what you're coming from and what you actually mean. Because one of the things that I think is so exciting about your work and why so many people are tuning into it is you have this great critique, but then you're also saying, like, guys, it's here. People are doing this. Right. This isn't some magical notion. Right. There's plenty of other ways of organizing an economy, of being human beings, in fact.
Well, in the capitalist system, and this is what when people say to me, do you follow Marx? I really don't even know what they're asking. I mean, Marx is dead.
Do you follow Marx? Him. Where is he? Is he around?
Yeah, exactly.
He's not on Twitter.
Is he on Twitter?
Is he behind? Yeah, that's right.
He did an Instagram with Cardi B, actually.
That I can listen to? Yeah.
I would love to watch Marx on Instagram with Cardi B. Wow.
Marx was one of the great thinkers of the modern world. If you're an educated human being, you expose yourself to that. You read St. Augustine, not because you want to be a Catholic, if you want one, but because he's one of the great thinkers of the world, and he had a lot of things to say, was a smart guy. A lot of things came together in him or Thomas Aquinas or a host of others, and to be proud that you're not familiar with what this person said, especially when he's a unique contributor, that's a kind of strange stupidity, What is that about? Why would you be proud? And I've had plenty of teachers coming up in that same period that you were coming up. I mean, I'm older than you, but nonetheless, I was a teacher at the time you were a student. And my colleagues were simply afraid. They had learned in the United States that if you're an economics professor like me, and you express an interest in Marx, you can kiss your career goodbye. You're not going to get tenure if you don't have it. You're not going to be a favored professor even if you have tenure. The publishers are going to look funny at your book. If they send out the manuscript you're hoping to get published, it'll go to somebody who sees it's you and knows that you're in favor of Marx, and they don't want to be associated with having supported and encouraged and endorsed. It wasn't very subtle. It was fear. And the fear made them stay away from it, so they never learned it. So when a student raises his or her hand and asks a question about Marxism, they either have to say, I don't know, which is very hard for professors to ever do, or they have to give a dismissive answer to kind of suggest to the student, you shouldn't be wasting our time with that stuff, which is a real clear signal to the student which way the wind here is blowing. So you have now, from the late 40s until almost now, that's a long time. That's over half a century of making this a taboo.
Yeah.
And it has meant that we can't think about changing the system. It's kind of bizarre. Think about it. Americans are pretty good. We debate our education system. We're currently debating what is a marriage or not, what is sexuality or not, what is a family or not. These are big institutions. We're questioning them. Comes to capitalism, impossible. You can't go there. You can't look at the big alternatives. It is scary. It is dangerous. It's disloyal. Wow. What is this? This is a weird taboo. It's as if capitalism has taken on all the trappings that sex once did, or other religions, or other topics that are taboo. You can't go near them. And it's sad. It just hobbles us as a nation, so we can't ask the obvious question. If we've tried for 100 or 200 years to fix capitalism's instability, and we haven't been able to, we're smart people. It's been tried in England, in Europe, in Asia, and lots of people have, for all different reasons, tried to get that under control. We're not able to do it. That means we ought to question whether a system change is maybe a better response. And when you add to the instability, the inequality, the fact that every few years a good-thinking person raises his or her hand and says, hey, folks, there's a lot of poor people amongst us. And we have a big to-do and TV specials and documentaries about the poverty that's all around us. Gee,
where did that come from?
Right, you just have to go a few blocks into the Bronx and wow, will you see poverty? Or a few yards off the interstate and there it is. And we all go, yes, yeah. And then we have a war against poverty. We have anti-poverty programs. And we can't solve them. We have more inequality in America today than we have had probably for the last 50, 75 years. We've been working at it. We have good people trying it. We have think tanks that come up with anti-poverty initiatives left and right, and it doesn't work. That's another hint that you got a system problem here. But in a country that can't ask itself that question, can't dare. Well, let me give you a very concrete example. I was blown away. And maybe you and I don't agree on this, but I was blown away the other day.
Totally
disagree. I picked up the newspaper, and I heard, it was The Guardian, the British newspaper The Guardian, and in there is a description of an interview that they had with Hillary Clinton. And the core of the interview was Hillary Clinton explaining to the Europeans that they were needing to face a fact. We're going to have to be harsher and harder with immigrants, because if we're not, it creates these right-wing populist movements. And I said to myself, my goodness, the Democrats are so upset. The Republicans came up with a scapegoat, how to get people who are upset by an economic system that isn't working to be angry at immigrants coming on a caravan from Honduras. I mean, what a nutty idea. You know, a country of 325 million people with maybe 10 million undocumented immigrants. No way is the economic life of 325 shaped in a significant way by the poorest of the poor 10 million. It's nonsense. But it's worked for the Republicans, and the Democrats didn't have something comparable. They didn't have an alternative story to tell about the economic suffering. They tried that lame business about Russians. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter, but it didn't work. The immigrant story went better than the Russian story, although they're equally plausible, in my own humble opinion. So she can't find a way to say the obvious, which is we have an economic system with a problem, which would make her very interesting to large numbers of people. Instead, being unable to raise the system question, she ends up seconding the Republicans on immigration. What a failure. What a collapse.
Well, I disagree with you, I guess, just on the immigration part.
Yes.
No, I'm just kidding. He said I might disagree. He goes to Hillary Clinton's most odious interview.
No, it's just you go.
No, but they can't. I mean, isn't that
can't.
the point? They couldn't even. I read that piece too, and the only deviation, Blair and Clinton basically said the same thing about immigration. Renzi from Italy actually said, "Oh no, it's fear mongering, and we need to respond to that." But none of them could even, and this is where you could, even if you were just being a social democrat, none of them could even talk about austerity. And none of them could say, well, we need to pivot against austerity.
Which is why everybody's abandoning those socialist parties across Europe, because they made weak comments against austerity and then got voted in on the basis of that and turned around and administered the very austerity they had claimed to be against. You saw it first with Syriza in Greece, and then it spread. The French Socialist Party.
Because Hollande got in even before Syriza. He said, I'm going to re-engineer the Eurozone.
Yeah.
That guy left with, I think, a 4% approval rating.
Right. Well, Mr. Macron is, and I am enjoying this. Part of my family's French. Mr. Macron is following Hollande's footsteps.
Oh, yeah.
You know, he was in the Socialist Party. He was in Hollande's government.
Yeah, yeah.
And he is just, over the last week, he outdid Trump. He attacked the biggest national cross-politics demonstration against the French government in decades. Unified. Everybody from Le Pen on the right to Mélenchon on the left and everything in between in French politics put on those yellow jackets and went into the streets the way only the French ever do and said, this government is corrupt, it's in bed with the big oil companies, and they're ripping us all off. Everybody agreed, and Mr. Macron said, shame on you, thereby taking his popularity, which is a stunning 13 or 14%, and knocking it down 50% of that. I mean, it's just...
He's atrocious.
It's just
Macron
awful.
is atrocious, and it says a lot that he's the great hope
Yes.
of a certain part of the commentariat.
Well, at this point, he will have a hard time surviving there politically.
Well, then, okay, so talk then about, then Brexit. And then even if he has a hard time surviving politically, do we go to Mélenchon or do we get another set of monsters in power, right? Because the fascists are waiting on the wings.
Right.
This is the global dynamic.
Well, the people who run these societies are unwilling, unable to think their way through a basic critique. They're hoping this problem will solve itself, as they always have, going through their crises. They're willing to go so far with these Keynesian policies, and beyond that, it's crossing your fingers and hoping. The Brexit is in its own way a remarkable variation on this theme. If you look at the statistics, just wages, to pick one, from 2008 to the present, the country in Europe, actually the country in all advanced political industrialized countries, the working class that did the worst were the British. Their real wages dropped 10 to 15%. Other people were flat. We were flat in this country, but theirs really dropped. So it's savage for the British working class. So one would expect something unusual from them because they've really been whacked. They got whacked by the crash of 2008, and they got whacked by the austerity program of the conservative government ever since. So when the conservatives, reading their political tea leaves in the inimitable upside-down way that these people do, decided it would be a monstrously clever thing to deal with the right wing. They're already a right-wing group, but the further rights, who were, just like everywhere else, pointing the finger at foreigners. Just like Trump attacks immigrants or attacks our trading partners, foreigners all, so they would do it. It is Europe that's doing it to us. Because if you get the British working class angry at Europeans, then they won't hopefully be angry at the system,
at us,
that is screwing, which is led by them. Okay,
right.
So there they go. So the right-wingers do it, but the others don't want to do that because they're making a lot of money. They are okay. They've recovered from the crash, and they're doing particularly well hiring Polish and other workers who come across from Eastern Europe to get jobs in England, and this is all working nicely for them. So they don't want to do it. So they say, okay, we'll put it up to a vote. Are we, the English, going to abandon Europe? Of course not. Stupid. What they didn't understand was the vote had nothing to do with Europe. That was just the ostensible purpose. What was really in the minds of the mass of people was they wanted to give the finger to the people who had been screwing them for 10 years really badly. So when they saw the elite say, of course, stay, it was called stay in Europe,
And they saw even the Labor Party in those days supporting, not enthusiastically, but basically supporting staying, because the Labor Party at least understood that for the working class of England, being in of Europe, out of Europe, that's not their problem. That's not their issue, one way or the other. So what was left to the people was, if the ruling class wants us to do it, the least we can do is say no. Right. I believe it's exactly the same impulse that led large numbers of Americans to look right past Trump's weirdness and say, I'm voting for Trump because I want to give the finger to the Bush-Clinton game show of alternating the same thing, center-left, center-right. I want something different. I want to show I'm angry. That's what the British did. They voted to leave Europe. Makes absolutely no sense. Doesn't do anything for the British working class. If anything, makes their life harder, as they're now, by the way, figuring out. So, but you see there the rage and the anger that's looking for a place to go. The right wing gives them anti-immigrants, anti-foreigners. And the center-left gives them nothing.
Job training.
More of the same
Learn
old
how
stuff.
to use the internet.
That's why
have skills that will equip you to
contrary
compete
to a
in the
lot of my
21st
friends,
century.
if this keeps up, if we're going to get another Clinton or a clone of Clinton versus Trump, I think his chances are good because he'll run the same game, the only game he knows anyway, to be Mr. Outrageous, and people are going to feel outraged, and they're going to go with the outrageous guy because the return to normalcy isn't attractive.
That's not going to happen. From the perspective of what Jeremy Corbyn is trying to do, and I want to get your perspective on that, and then actually I do want to, in a few minutes, pivot to Syriza, but before that, I've heard, so Brexit as it's currently constituted it's not going to be good for the United Kingdom, and it's not going to be good. And even someone like Tony Blair, who says this is going to implicate what we can spend on NHS. This is going to implicate on how we regulate. This is going to implicate even our environmental policies. He's not wrong, even though he's obviously, that's not his concern. Right. On the other hand, and that any kind of ambitious labor agenda is going to be immediately undermined by the economic shockwaves of that. On the other hand, if Jeremy Corbyn ignores what still is a democratic mandate, right or wrong, and instead of pushing for an election as a result of these shambolic negotiations, says, well, I'm going to align with the City of London and the bankers and all the mainstream leaders of all the parties and Tony Blair for a second referendum, then his sort of core brand proposition as a genuine, distinct player, Tony Blair said Jeremy Corbyn's like Trump, and it's offensive and ridiculous, but it's also true. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn really represents something different. So of those two choices of aligning to avert a catastrophe of Brexit so that there can be this more ambitious program that they want versus just saying the vote already happened, we're not going to play interference for Theresa May or the City of London, and we go forward with this renewed social democracy, or actually democratic socialism, seems to me. What do you think they should do if you're
that's
talking
easy.
to them?
I think if he caves in and becomes an advocate for what Theresa May is basically running around Great Britain now doing.
Well, no, not for May, but for a second vote.
No, fine. But basically, that's all understood inside England as either you're for it or against it. Right. A second vote is people are hoping that the second vote undoes the first vote, etc. If he does that, he's done. In my judgment, writing his own political obituary. He'll be done. He'll be like all the others. You're absolutely right. He has made more gains than anyone imagined he could when he started by being different and by holding on to his radicalism, appealing to the several 100,000 young Britons who joined the Labour Party because of him. He shows in England what Bernie could have accomplished here had he had those opportunities and moved in a comparable, adjusting for American conditions, way. He is Britain's Bernie. in many ways. And I think right now it's in a difficult place. I understand it. But if I were advising him, I'm not, but if I were, I would urge him absolutely to say this is not a struggle that the British people should be spending their time on. This was a bad idea in the first place. It was a ploy of the conservatives to stay in power. It has led to a disastrous 2 years. If it goes through, it will be bad for us. If it doesn't go through with these people, it'll be bad for us. We need a fundamental change here at home. That's what'll help the mass of the British people. That's what we're about. That's what he should, if I were him, that's what he should do. That's his best hope. And I don't believe for a minute that if there had been, well, let me put it differently. If Bernie Sanders could have been a viable candidate in the sense, I mean, he was a viable candidate.
He made himself viable.
Right, he was a viable candidate. I meant if he had been allowed some way, in some magical way to come forward, and you would have had a choice for the American people between two people that are clearly outside what you hate, the old establishment you don't want, and you're not going to choose between a left version and a right version. I'm not sure how that election would have come out. I think he would have had a good chance.
I think he would have won. I think
might
especially
very well
in the
have won.
places where he would have won Wisconsin. I mean, you could just start making it really specific. I think he would win those Rust Belt states.
I also know, which I'm amazed at because of my family, that in the Deep South, there were all kinds of people who haven't voted Democratic for decades, who voted for Bernie Sanders because he was something different they could get excited about, whereas the Democrats they didn't like, and the Republicans they didn't much like either. So they looked around, and when Bernie came forward, they went for him. And when he disappeared, they went for Trump. I don't think that's a small number of people. You know?
I don't know. I don't know how you measure it. What is the most? What is policy that Labor's working on that you're most excited about?
British Labor?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me first, I mean, you obviously know where I'm going, but let me first say that of all the leftist parties in the developed world, I'm as surprised as anyone by what I'm about to say. That the most exciting and the most innovative is Great Britain. It's the Labour Party in England. They are putting to shame all of the others. And the issue that is so remarkable is the one put forward mostly by his assistant, his second in command, a man named John MacDonald.
He'll be Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Exchequer, if in the shadow cabinet, the way they run it in England. That's right. And he's made the clearest statements. They are committed to do in England what to my knowledge, no other leftist party, socialist party, anti-capitalist party, whatever you want to call it, has so far been willing to do. Here's their commitment. If they win the next election, and the polls in England indicate they have a very good chance of doing that, if they win the next election and Mr. Corbyn then becomes prime minister, etc., they will pass a law early in their administration that reads as follows, roughly, the key core of it. Any British enterprise can continue in whatever form it exists. Self-employment, corporation, partnership, doesn't matter. But if, and here it comes, if that enterprise were to decide either to shut down, to stop functioning, or to sell itself to any other enterprise, or to move out of the country, or to go public to issue shares, any of those four acts, they would have to first give what's called the right of first refusal to their own employees to buy the company outright and convert it into a worker co-op. And to the questions that the reporters threw at him when he said this, well, where in the world would the workers get the money? Mr. MacDonald smiled and said, we will lend it to them. At a very attractive, we the government, because we will be the government.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I'm saying.
You want to know how we're going to do quantitative easing? Jack, here's how. Here's how.
You want to know how they're going to do it there, de Blasio, with your Amazon deal?
Yes. And exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
What could be further removed? Right.
Right.
But here's the punchline that I think Americans might fight for. When pressed to explain all of this, because they were shocked, he said, look, we want to give the British people freedom of choice. We want them to be able to choose. Do you want an economic system of top-down, hierarchical capitalist organization, corporations, boards of directors, shareholders, all of that? Or do you want democratic workplaces where workers together, one person, one vote, make the decisions? Do you want it all one way or the other? Do you want a mix, like, I don't know, 40, 60% or something? But in order for us to have that freedom of choice, the British people have to know both options. They don't know one of the options very well because while we have worker co-ops, we don't have very many. I mean, they have way more than we do in America, but they don't have very many. Italy, for example, has many more. So the British have to have a worker co-op, a democratic enterprise sector that's everywhere, so that the British people can buy from them whatever products they want and can work in them to see what a life of work in that environment is. Once we've had that, once we, the government, have created the conditions, there can be a free democratic vote that illustrates what the people want in the way of a brilliant. I mean, this is just,
Yeah.
your mouth drops. Because even to the American people who want, they want to be able to choose 15 different kinds of toothpaste in the shelf in the drugstore. Okay, here you're going to get freedom of choice in a way you've never had before about something that matters a whole hell of a lot more than your toothpaste does. And it's democratic, it's American, it's electoral, it's got all the parts. And they've worked this out, and they are going to their people. This is an electoral winner. They're getting votes, they're getting excitement. It's new, it's original, it's exciting. It will transform your life, your work life, your community life overnight. It'll give you something to fight for. Whoa, it has got a lot of political oomph in it, and it's just a tragedy for me that it hasn't been picked up yet, even by Mr. Sanders.
Yeah,
Bernie
Sanders,
it's time. In his campaign, by the way, he favored co-ops. So he's on record as being at least sympathetic.
And he supported them when he was mayor of Burlington.
Right.
There's actually accomplishments in Burlington from his time as mayor. Two more quick things I want to touch on before we go to the postgame. And I want to say we're going to talk about Mondragon in the postgame. So we'll get into more of this co-op model in the postgame. But I want to touch first on Syriza in Greece and then I'll go to Brazil for a second. So I'll give you just a little preamble. I don't have a defense of Syriza, but it seemed to me that we were a little too, or many people were very optimistic in a way that was kind of naive about Syriza, because they came into power and they're a peripheral player in the Eurozone. They don't have much power. They're locked into these monetary arrangements, and it didn't seem like there was a real, and a lot of people have pointed this, a lot of scholars of Syriza pointed out that there wasn't actually a sort of strategic plan to mobilize a base or prepare a country for a transition. I think John Sall pointed out, if I recall correctly, that even Yanis Varoufakis, who had the more radical perspective, was still under the just naive assumption that going to the European policymakers and saying, hey, guys, this vicious austerity doesn't make any sense. We can have a win-win here. We can have that Keynesian thing. It will be better for us and better for you. And Varoufakis says in his own books, when he would say this, policymakers would look at him like he was, speaking another language. Like this has nothing to do with why we're implementing this austerity on Greece. So I guess my question is the story of the failure of Syriza, and obviously you can elaborate it, is this a story of a party failing because of a lack of nerve and leadership, or is it a revelation again about the limits of social democracy in a global capitalist economy? And does that have a cautionary tale or a concern point for labor as they think about power?
No, it's the classic political question. Let me give you an answer that won't satisfy you. It's all those things,
Right.
and I don't think we should.
It's overdetermined.
That's
It's
right,
a good-
exactly,
good
and
Marxist
it's we'll
term
get to
right
that.
there.
Sure, part of the story is Greece is a small country. You can do unspeakable things to Greece, which they did, particularly the Germans and the French. You can use them as a whipping boy. You can use them as a scapegoat, and you can use them as a test case. How badly can you whack a working class and it still won't revolt? All of that was done. Greece was used in that way. Did the Greek leftists, Syriza was an amalgam of different leftist groups in Greece that came together, did they fully appreciate that? No. Were they under some delusions about what socialist governments in the rest of Europe would or wouldn't do to protect them, to help them, to save them? Yeah, they probably were deluded a bit about that.
May I actually just add briefly, and doesn't that also have lessons that we always have to be mindful of in all of these things about xenophobia and racism, because of all of this bigotry from the northern to southern zone, right? I mean, that must play a role in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
They wanted to believe, as people in their situation always do, that it isn't as bad as it turned out it could be. And, you know, in a way they were right. It hadn't been. Greece hadn't been treated badly. It was under the pressure of the people who run Germany and France, who allowed that kind of language because it helped them.
Yeah.
It helped them justify what they were doing to Greece, to portray the Greeks as people who live on a pension, people who don't work, all of that. And you could see, if you went to Greece at the time, and I did because I went there fairly often, you could see the Greeks actually splitting amongst themselves over this. It wasn't just Europe versus Greek. You had Greek private sector workers yelling that the public sector was ripping everybody off. The way you do here, you get private sector workers who think everybody who works for the government is lazy, doesn't do anything, gets paid too much, etc., etc. So these kinds of things are there. They've been honed and developed over the years of capitalism. They're available to be used on moments like this, and they were. And did they not sufficiently appreciate that? Yes, I think so. But I don't want to let the powers that be off the hook. I mean, the basic issue, and I hope people here have figured this out anyway, but the basic issue at that time was not that the Greek government borrowed too much money. Sure it did, as governments have always done and have been doing ever since, led by our own. I mean, we just, in December of 2017, after 40 years of rich getting richer, we gave the corporations a tax cut they didn't need at a time of the economy when it didn't need it. I mean, it's crazy what it was done, and it racked up our deficit. Suddenly, for Republicans who yelled deficit, they didn't yell anything anymore.
Well, now they are, because now they're coming from Medicare and Social Security.
Yes, and
That's
now they
how
bring
the
it up
game
again.
goes.
I mean, it's amazing stuff. So the big issue was not that the Greeks had borrowed, but the big issue, which is amazing to me as an economics professor, when you teach banking, you teach people there's two sides to a loan. There's the borrower and the lender. A loan only happens if both of them agree to the terms. It's not... A loan can't be blamed on one of them because it takes two to tango. Therefore, if the Greeks were borrowing too much, what were the lenders doing lending them? The second thing we teach in all banking courses is that it's the job of the lender, not the borrower, to be the prudent caretaker. It's the job of the lender to say, no, I'm not going to lend to you because it isn't a secure way to use my depositor's money if I'm a commercial bank. The burden on making a decision about the wisdom, the safety of a loan is on the lender, not the borrower. The borrower wants the money, which is why traditionally the lender is the one who risks losing it if you lend to, you're supposed to be a prudent lender. So who lent to the Greek government? The Greek banks, the French banks, and the German banks. Some others, but those were the primary lenders. Okay, they should have been put into the screwer, the rack. They the ones who made the mistake. The French and the German banks what are they going to do? They can't control what the Greek government does. So the Greek government could have saved its own banks, punishing them in whatever way they thought appropriate, and then told the other banks, okay, you made a big mistake, but we're not going to suffer because you
We're not going to torture our people because you made a miscalculation.
You lent in an inappropriate way. Okay. The French and German banks understood this perfectly, so they concocted their plan. The governments, we want the government of Europe, the unified European government, to bail us out. We don't want to get stuck with uncollectible loans made to the Greek government that we should never have made. So here was the deal. The Europeans would tell a fake story, we're helping our Greek brothers. They gave the money to the Greeks on condition. That money has to be used to pay off the banks. So instead of you owing money to the private banks, which you can't pay, you're going to owe money to us, the European governments, and the nice private banks are held harmless. We will bail them out through you, leaving you with a loan to us, and then we're going to be Mr. Tough Guy, demanding that you do this and showing how we're not going to hurt our people because we're going to make you Greeks pay. It wasn't the people they were saving. It was those banks. It was a very clever plan. That's all this was. The rest was the theater. It's like watching Mr. Trump do his theater about the invasion of these poverty-stricken Hondurans being a threat to this is theater, high theater, but with the right bells and whistles, and if the lighting is correct, you pull this off. Like that movie, Wag the Dog, you remember?
The Dog, yeah,
with Dustin Hoffman and brilliant.
De Niro,
That's what this was. This was lots of, what was that guy, Schauble, the finance minister under Merkel.
Oh,
he was Mr.
Schwaber?
Bad. Yeah, he was the Mr. Bad guy, and so he could be portrayed, and yeah, Yanis Varoufakis, who I have worked with, and I know him personally, and his ally here in the United States, Jamie Galbraith, a professor of economics at Texas, who I also know, they were working on a way to get out of this.
Right.
They were working on a way to get out. They're good people for you to bring if you haven't already.
I would love to talk with Professor.
Well, we should talk about that.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd love to talk. That would be great. Oh, thank you.
But they could have, they were working on a plan, but they were economists, and you have to have the political conditions to make this.
Does this have a lesson for labor, or is labor has a lot more relative power, obviously?
Well, the lesson is, I know this is maybe a problem. Let me quote a very good strategist, a man named Lenin.
Please, we quote Lenin freely on this show.
Well, Lenin, smart guy. And
great guy. Did a great job. A lot of people are saying it.
Right. But he said, if you're going to go up against capitalism, it's a complicated chain, and you better be sure you're getting the weakest link. He felt that Russia in 1917, having just lost World War I, and having a corrupt government that was not liked by the people, against whom there had been a few years earlier the 1905 revolution, that in 1917, under those circumstances, it was the weak link, and a very small but militant, well-organized party could have power in that weak link situation. But you have to be very careful about where you do it, when you do it, how you do it, because of the very circumstances that meant in Greece it wasn't going to happen.
Right.
And I'm not blaming Syriza. They get part of the blame, but a lot of other things do too.
Right.
That's the trick of politics, what's possible under each set of circumstances.
Well, so actually, all right, one part of the Brazil question briefly before we go to the postgame. There's another more elaborate one, which I'll read to you in the postgame. But it seems to me, and obviously I'll always stipulate my usual free lula. This is very important to me and very important to the show. And if you want to speak to that too, please. But the lesson from Brazil is you were talking about what way the elites will break. And one of the things that's so horrifying about Brazil, and the level of propaganda is so relentless about the Workers' Party and the social movements and everything, and the comfort with Bolsonaro's, objectively fascist and eliminationist rhetoric, that they basically created, and I know you'll have a critique of this because it obviously didn't sustain itself, but there was a sort of a win-win where tens of millions are getting lifted out of poverty. There's huge social progress. Brazil has a better, more respected place in the world. And all of that happened primarily under Lula, but also under Dilma. And the elites, many of whom did great in those years, still broke for fascism. And so I'm just curious of that lesson, too, of in a fight, if we're going to say that you need to actually mobilize people for some type of left agenda, should it also be the lesson that the center or the elite or whatever else you're going to call it, they will, they'll break in this authoritarian way. Is that, yeah.
That's a lesson.
Yeah.
You should have learned that lesson long ago. That's the lesson of the 20th century. There's no reason to believe, and let's remember, 2 world wars in that century. Nazism, fascism, Franco in Spain, Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, and on and on. They were less threatened by the left in many ways than today. And yet they, in the hysterical fight back of the people who stood to lose their dominant position, they were prepared to make a common cause literally with the devil. That was your Mephistopheles fantasy or myth all wrapped up. And I see it in Venezuela. I see it in Brazil. I see it in all these places. I saw it in Cuba.
What does that tell us about people like Castro and Chavez? We have to think a little bit more practically about those people, don't we?
Well, yeah, I think Mr. Castro showed the way. Let me use a metaphor.
That should be the title for tonight's show, possibly. I think Mr. Castro showed the way.
Yes, he did. Well, for sheer, if
and
nothing
please
else,
tell the story, too, if you can.
Yeah, if nothing else, look at the longevity.
Yes.
90 miles away, it survived. That's its achievement. That it had flaws, plenty. That it made mistakes, sure. It survived.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
Anyway,
right.
Here's the metaphor. If you have a war, and it's a bitter war, and you win, that is, you have a culminating battle and you're the winner of the battle, you then have always a choice to make in a military way. What are you going to do with the people you've defeated? You can say, well, the war is over, let's be good guys. And turn around and go home. Leave them with their weapons. Leave them with their bitterness. Leave them with their wounds. Or you can say, no, that's too dangerous. These people are just going to wait and regroup, and then we're going to have this again. So you can take from them their weapons and take steps so that you leave them alone, you let them function, you don't persecute them, but you remove their capacity to renew the hostilities.
Yeah.
You do that.
Right.
Well, now let's do it politically. And let me use the American example. In the 1930s, you had an upsurge in the United States. You had the greatest unionizing drive the country has ever seen. The CIO, middle of the 1930s, organizes millions of American workers who had never been in a union before, whose parents had never been in a union, because they were terrified that in the Great Depression they were going to suffer, and a union would give them a better shot at getting through this bad time. That's all they hoped for. And the unions were allied together with 2 socialist parties and a communist party. And they were big in those days because of the Great Crash. They had grown. Both of the socialist parties, the Trotskyite Socialist Party and the regular Socialist Party, and the American Communist Party. And they worked closely together to mobilize and organize. And they went to Roosevelt and they said, okay, we've got millions of people, we're well organized, we're communist, social, we know how to do this, and we got good unions, and we want you to help us, Mr. Roosevelt, because people are suffering. It's the Great Depression, the unemployment rate is 25%, et cetera, et cetera. And the subtext of the conversation was, if you don't help us, we're not going to vote for you again, and you won't be elected dog catcher in this country, let alone president. Mr. Roosevelt, smart guy, understood exactly what he was facing, went back to the rich and the corporations, he was one of them anyway, and he said, you know, you better give me the money to help the mass of people. The government doesn't have any money because the mass of people aren't paying taxes, they're unemployed. So the only place to go for money to help the people is you. So you got to give me. And my advice to you is you give me a good chunk of your money, because if you don't, there's going to be a revolution. You're not going to have any money at all. So this is in your interest. He split them. Half of them thought he was just BSing them, and their descendants are called the Koch brothers. And the other half, well, basically,
No,
and,
that's right.
and the other half
Right.
bought the argument. That's all he needed. He went back to the socialist, communists, and unions, and he said, okay, I'm going to do more for you than you thought I could. I have now the money from them. And I'm going to do it, but there's a condition. No more talk about revolution, no more talk about end of capital. That rhetoric has to stop, otherwise the deal's off. And they all bought it. I mean, there were people who didn't like it, but the majority bought the deal. And he did. He created Social Security, unemployment compensation, passed the first minimum wage, and had a government hiring program that put 15 million people to work, saving their homes and the mortgages and all the rest. And we all know that history. Okay, think of that as the winning side in a war. What happened now? What happened now is nothing more happened. You left the capitalists in the position of owning the enterprises, gathering into their hands the profits. Okay, what did they do? The minute Roosevelt died and the war, World War II was over, they took the position you left them with, the weapons you never took from them, and they went to work to undo the New Deal. They went to work to demonize the communists. They weren't the militants who led the strikes. They were agents of Russia, and you got rid of them. Then you went around the country teaching everybody that socialists are just like communists. They just spell it differently, and you got to get rid of them. And then you destroyed the labor movement.
I mean, this is very analogous to what's happening in Brazil.
Absolutely.
And what just happened. I mean, it's
And Mr. Lula should have, I mean, no disrespect.
I was going to say, the one thing that could ever make me get hard with you, Professor, Lula.
No, but the mistake,
yes.
and it's not just him. The mistake is you left in place in Brazil. Maybe because you had no choice. He could be sitting here and saying, we couldn't have done it. But my answer would be, okay, I accept that.
Right.
That may be right. But did you understand what you were opening the space for when you whacked them a good one, but left them in a position to go after you about it? Which is exactly what they did. Right. They put him in jail and brought this guerrilla into position to undo everything he did. And they may not have been able to do it, but not trying strikes me as a very dangerous sign. They may have missed an opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading. I read a recent Castro autobiography, and at the time Lula was in office, and Castro praised him and said he was doing incredible things, and understood his context. But what it's done for me is it's made me. It's made me rethink Chavez, basically, because I think that the lessons of, especially someone like Lula, who was this, conciliatory guy who produced so many good outcomes for everybody, and if the response is still just this utter viciousness, it really shows you, more realistically and more seriously what people actually did have to contemplate.
If you have ever, I had twice in my life the occasion to talk honestly with Cubans who had left Cuba, which, by the way, is another variable. If you have that many people leave the island and it's all those people, that's another way of solving the problem. You don't, in other words, they don't have the people to pull off the reactionary fight back because they're all living in Florida.
They're all they all came here to vote for Marco Rubio.
And I work, yes. And I spent some time
occasionally
talking
blow
with
up an
them.
airliner.
Yeah, that's right. I talked with them. And the interesting thing they taught me was, I don't know how to say this other, but they're using psychological language. Their level of hatred for Castro, for the Cuban Revolution, was pathological. You could see that beyond their business they may have lost, or their career that was hurt, or whatever. They told me what had happened to them, but nothing that had happened to them could explain or justify the level of their world had been taken away, their assumptions, their notion of what the order of the world was. It made out of Castro someone so devilish that killing them or dropping them from an airplane began to make sense. There was a level of hatred that was truly astonishing. I wanted it several times to take, because they were nice people, by the way, personally were perfectly nice people. I wanted to take them and get some professional help. I mean, this is, there's something wrong. This is off the chart. This is not within the realm. Yes, you don't like Castro, you're against his policies, you think it damaged Cuba. I can hear all that. You have your arguments. But this level of hatred, and that's what I see in Brazil.
Oh, it's
and that's what I see in those middle-class people banging the pots in Caracas. There's something going on there that their world is destroyed. They had a world in which they were a small, comfortable middle class surrounded by a sea of abject poverty. They had come to terms with that. They were more cultured. They were more educated. They were more refined. And the world was upside down because these unrefined, uneducated were taking over and telling them what to do.
But I have to say, on the flip side, I mean, the last thing I'd say is, I mean, okay, so it's made me rethink Chavez, and certainly Chavez is a leader. On the other hand, I mean, there's real self-generated problems that in Venezuela now. Mostly, I mean, obviously the United States is interfering there relentlessly, but I mean, the reasons in some ways that Brazil underlines it for me so much is because those people didn't lose their status. They didn't have they made more money. They did all they actually had to deal with. In Cuba and Venezuela, they might have lost something. In Brazil, all they had to deal with was like, oh, maybe that person, instead of being in abject poverty, has a decent house now. Right. And that still set them off. Right. That still made them lose their minds.
The order of the universe was threatened. Right. Lula did enough for them to realize you're not the top, you're not secure, this could change.
That's why they hate him so much too. Yes. Because he's smarter and a better leader than them, and he didn't go to college, and he's a metal worker. Right. And that's why a guy like Cardozo, who's the president before him and an academic, is why he last thing, I know I've mentioned this before we go to postgame, but Cardozo said he would not make an endorsement in the presidential race between Haddad and Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro had literally said years ago that Cardozo should have been killed. Yeah. He still wouldn't intervene. Yeah. And I think there's no doubt. It's psychological. It's what you're talking about. Yeah.
It's a notion that this really is God versus the devil, and God is on top. And now these devils are on top, and that has to be stopped. It's the end of something they couldn't even put their finger on. And you're right, in Brazil, partly because of what Lula did, partly because Brazil was at the right place with the United States and China and all that. Yeah. They didn't have the basis for being anywhere near so upset. But even in Cuba, where they had some basis, it wasn't adequate to this level. When I would explain to them, look, the Cubans are doing that, they would tell me, no, they're not doing that. And I would show them the UN reports. They couldn't stop and even deal with the simplest factual matter. It didn't matter to them. The thing was evil and had to be destroyed in a way that's, for me, scary, because you're not anymore on the normal kind of conversation. You're with a person who terrifies you by the level of upset and rage and hatred bubbling up out of them. It's very scary.
David, this is how you should feel when the professor's here. You understand that? Mind your P's and Q's. You got that? All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to the post game, and we're going to talk a little bit about Althusser. We're going to talk a little bit about Mondragon. We'll take a few of your calls before we get out of here. Before we go, we'll have a list of all the places that they could find you on the show notes, but tell them.
Well, let's see. We do a regular weekly radio and television show called Economic Update. And I talk about what's going on in the economy every week, interview people, do presentations. It's a kind of way to keep up with a critical perspective. And you can see it on YouTube,
yes,
where it's available. If you're inclined to be supportive, you can go to patreon.com/economic update and get it that way. We are also very active on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, either under the name democracyatwork.info, which is our website, or under my name, or under the name Economic Update, which is our program and one of our major activities. We also have groups that are working on these kinds of issues that we're concerned about around the country. I give a talk every other month at the Judson Memorial Church in Washington Square in New York City. I travel around the country a good bit. And we try to do basically two things. One, argue that capitalism is the problem. It's a systemic problem, and the solution is systemic change. That doesn't make us so original because a number of people are doing that these days, I'm happy to say. But where we are, I think, a bit more original is we think we have a solution. We don't just point, as you gave us credit kindly before, at what's wrong, although we focus on that. We think that reorganizing the enterprise is key, that we never did that. That what the previous efforts to change, that's where they didn't take away the weapons of the other side. That's where they didn't take that last step. If you don't want the business community to undo every single socially progressive program that people try to get through, the way they did with the New Deal, then you have to change the organization of those enterprises. Otherwise, you're giving people with every incentive to undo your social program the resources with which to do that. And that's a terrible self-destructive mistake. So our argument is what the revolutions or the movements for social change, what they didn't do that they should have was to change the organization of enterprises.
Not being socialist is an own goal.
Right.
Let's
break the hierarchy of enterprise, make them democratic, then they become the ally of your social movement rather than the adversary.
Perfect. We're going to talk more about that in the postgame. Patreon.com/TMBS. Get your tickets to the Bell House February 1st. Thank you, super producer Matt Leck, chief economist David Griscom, super producer David Slavic. We will see you in the postgame.
We'll take a 5-minute break.